It's hard enough making a buck in the harsh environments of outer space, let alone when you have all manner of deadly creatures at your throat or a band of space pirates after your booty. Thankfully, with enough patty melt, you can be sure to keep your health high and your credits stacked too. Welcome to entry 0.6 of the Starfield Handbook, your most reliable source of Starfield information in the settled systems. Today's entry is all about survival, and we're going to dig into defensive equipment, impairments and illnesses, healing items, and general mechanics related to survivability. Let's get started. When it comes to space exploration, a well-crafted spacesuit and helmet will be paramount to survival. Unlike in Elder Scrolls and Fallout, where we could acquire armor from many different body parts, our customization in Starfield is limited to spacesuits, helmets, packs, and apparel from what we've seen. It's not clear what the depth of apparel will be and whether they provide defensive stats like helmets and spacesuits do, and the same goes for packs as well. I'm leaning towards apparel being purely cosmetic, while packs will certainly have some utility to them, either for carrying capacity, improved boost pack performance, and possibly defensive statistics as well. As for spacesuits and helmets, we do have some confirmed images of them in the inventory and the stats that they provide. We have a good look at 4 spacesuits here, and it gives us some great context of what we're going to need to protect ourselves against, both in a combat perspective and with regards to the environments we visit in our travels. We discussed in our combat entry that we have 3 classes of damage, those being physical, energy, and electromagnetic. Against humanoid enemies, we'll certainly see all 3 damage types come our way, but I'm wondering how often we'll see energy and EM damage come from creatures, if at all. If I had to guess, we'll maybe encounter a few unique creatures that damage with EM and energy, but it's more likely they'll have physical attacks imbued with status effects like burning, freezing, poison, etc. It's also quite likely they'll transmit some monster-specific diseases that we'll need to treat with researched medicines. There are even some examples that we've seen from the Direct in 2022 gameplay of creatures with different prefixes to their names that indicate that they have some sort of ailment or affliction tied to them. Hopefully we don't end up with a case of the rattles or ataxia. With regards to the numbers themselves on the 4 suits we see, the only thing worth mentioning is that the suits with a higher value have a significantly higher total defense regardless of weight. Interestingly though, the one suit that has 13 weight versus 8 actually also looks substantially larger, which I appreciate. We only get one look at a helmet, and the stat types are identical to the suits, so nothing much more to say on that front. However, we do know that you can receive helmets and presumably suits, and probably packs as well, of different rarities to provide additional perks, so you certainly want to keep your eye out for those. I will mention that there should almost certainly be transmogging in this game, given that Bethesda specifically describes the old Mars set that comes as a pre-order bonus as a skin pack and not as an item specifically. So any of you more fashion-forward space explorers should feel at ease knowing that you can rock whatever you want clothing-wise. In terms of environmental protection, we have thermal, airborne, corrosive, and radiation, and I think we'll find ourselves having to swap out our suits frequently to properly prepare ourselves for certain environments. For thermal, we can expect this to work on both ends of the temperature spectrum. We know that it's cold as hell on most celestial bodies that don't orbit just the right distance from the star within their system, and you're gonna get cooked on any that are too close, so an adequate suit temperature regulation will be critical. This is why we hear Todd describe planets as being in a Goldilocks zone of sorts that is reasonably capable of sustaining life due to being just right in all manners of temperature, atmosphere, and available resources for survival, at least for carbon-based life forms when we hear that term. Of course, I'm still expecting us to stumble across some creatures on what would appear to be completely uninhabitable planets for humans, where they happen to be thriving. Since many planets will likely fall on the extremes of temperature, I could see there being a baseline requirement of thermal protection to even visit certain planets. Honestly though, it feels like a little bit of a stretch, and I've never seen any indication of that in the star map before visiting a planet. However, we do know there are specific locations we'll come across where there are thermal symbols showing up on our chronomark, which will probably be our more common situations where thermal protection is actually needed when we're visiting some sort of polar region or potentially even volcanic locations. We've never heard anything about volcanoes or lava, but I'll be happy if that ends up being something that was intentionally omitted. This one's actually the most mysterious to me, and I'm not actually totally sure what airborne resistance specifically means, since I would expect us to not be breathing in the air on most planets we visit, unless we're in a major city where the atmosphere is already known to be safe. This may imply, though, that the technology used in our suit to supply us with oxygen takes in air from outside of our suit if an atmosphere with oxygen is present, and it's then processed to become breathable, and the presence of deadly gases may injure us during that process. Alternatively, we have an O2 tank, which would make that irrelevant, or we have a closed system within our suit that recycles CO2 into breathable O2 again somehow, again making it irrelevant. Honestly though, I feel like this whole oxygen concept is something Bethesda is going to be taking liberties on, as I haven't seen any concrete evidence of us having a limited O2 supply where we actually need to head back to our ship to resupply. With that said, I'm leaning more towards airborne being an illness and disease related protective stat that we may only have to worry about in the context of being attacked by creatures that carry disease and not in our general exploration, but we'll find out in a few days. If you're wondering where to find to the point, logical Starfield information on release, then I'm your guy. I know many of you are lucky to even get a couple hours of gaming in per day, so my promise is to give you content with none of the extra padding, just straight up information to get you out there doing the fun stuff as fast as possible. Let's get back to environmental factors we'll encounter in the game. Corrosive is really cool because it implies that we're going to be venturing to planets with highly acidic hazards, possibly pools of acid, extremely potent acid rains, acid-spitting enemies, or generally unsafe water that's acidic. Even though it would make sense, I'm not expecting any permanent damage to our suits, but I could see us having to provide some sort of treatment to acid burns. It would be great if we can harvest highly acidic resources as well that could be used in crafting. Our final environmental protection stat is against radiation, which has been a staple hazard in Fallout, and I'm expecting this to be the most problematic to all our exploration efforts, as RADS is a hassle to deal with without adequate protection or consumables to decrease RADS. If it's anything like Fallout, we'll see radiation buildup cause a proportional decrease to our max health, which if it reaches a certain threshold, will simply kill you. We know there are supposed to be weather changes that we can encounter as seen from this example, so rad storms may be on the menu as well. It'll be interesting to see whether we can come across creatures with radiation effects and mutations, and whether we'll find irradiated items that can be consumed with the penalty of applying rads, or weapons that can apply rads damage to enemies like irradiated weapons could in Fallout. I feel like I just said rad a dozen different times, but radiation is not rad. In terms of identifying these threats during our travels, our chronomark is able to provide us with a warning anytime we're in proximity of one. I've seen the rads and thermal one frequently in my research, with a few instances of corrosive and airborne, but I've never seen those hazards directly impacting the character from any of the footage I've watched. Speaking of chronomark displays, let's dig into what we know about illnesses, diseases, and other inhibitors which show up on our space watch. This is a good clip of Todd highlighting some of the hazards we just covered and a comment on hazards and illnesses as well.
We have a lot of biomes. We do look at temperature, we look at the radiation, we look at all of those things on a planet so that your suit and your protection, you can get certain ailments if you're not ready, and certain weather things can come through. There are obviously planets that might have one type of biome, and there are planets that have a whole bunch, and their creatures and the plants and everything go with the biomes.
It comes as no surprise that we'll be subjected to various forms of illness and disease, given that Fallout 76 built that feature out quite extensively, and we've seen something similar in previous BGS titles as well. To what degree we'll experience this in Starfield isn't clear, but I've collected a number of different examples that we'll see on our chronomark of our character either entering some fatigued state, or others where there seems to be a constantly applied debuff that may need some medicine or other intervention to cleanse it. The first examples I have are explicitly mentioned physical debuffs that we see our character experience both in and out of combat. The more I've looked at these clips, the more convinced I am that these are symptoms of particular illnesses and diseases that are marked on the left side of our chronomark. The first two examples we see take place in this lab sequence where we have a yellow triangle indicator that at first I thought looked like an explosion risk hazard sign, but now I'm thinking it actually represents a respiratory illness and it's supposed to show someone coughing. As we approach the lab, the character coughs and we get a purple pill indicator flash above it. I'm pretty sure this is to tell you that you can treat it with antibiotics or some other form of intervention. Then as we progress through the lab, we get another flash for soreness and the purple pill indicator again. There's also a white marker that shows above the yellow triangle, but it looks like another triangle of its own and could specifically be for the soreness that just popped up. I'm thinking it's either a delayed symptom that triggers after you cough enough and your throat is sore or your body is experiencing aches from extended illness, or this was the result of something different like repeat melee attacks since it triggers right after that final melee, and then maybe our character becomes sore because of it. With either symptom though, I'd expect there to be some sort of notable debuffs like slower O2 regen, faster depletion, or something similar. The only other example like this that I could find is joint pain, and again we see it show up in conjunction with one of those left side triangles being present at the same time. In this case, a blue triangle with 2 lines and a dot between them. If I had to guess, it seems like a likely candidate for a joint pain symbol, as that could represent joints or a set of injured bones. Again, this is pure speculation, but I feel like this holds some water. This time we don't see the purple pill pop up, so it doesn't seem like it's something we could treat. It could instead just be a timed debuff. It's worth noting that the sequence of footage we see before this pop-up features a lot of vertical boost packing that all takes place on Aquila, so if that was shot in the same session, perhaps if you aren't cushioning your landings, you can strain your legs temporarily, thus causing joint pain. That's the best I can come up with on this one. The other 2 icons we've seen include an orange triangle with what looks like 3 droplets inside, which could be indicative of an acid burn or a bleed effect. And then we have a red triangle with the sideways pill-looking shape, and I'm not sure about that one at all, honestly. These are the only examples I have on this front, but we do know for a fact that medicine is one of the core categories for research and crafting, so I'm expecting quite a few more ailments to show up in the complete game. Let me know if you have any theories of your own on what those little triangles could be. A final note here is that we know that there is a skill called decontamination that increases the chance to recover from infections naturally. So that may be something worth throwing points into if it becomes something we frequently have to deal with during gameplay. I'm very curious what the rank 4 perk will be on that one too. Let's move on to food and drink, our primary sources of healing that we currently know of outside of medicine craftables explicitly designed for healing like med packs. We only get a brief look at some of the food items, but we know cooking is a system of its own, with gastronomy providing us with the skills to whip up some interstellar delights and research new recipes too. Maybe Michelin even awards the best chefs in the galaxy with real stars for their culinary accolades now. The only drink we get to take a look at is the orange juice of transcendence, which is actually pretty neat since it's a trade-off type item. For sacrificing 1 health regen per second for a minute, you gain 8 max O2 for 5 minutes. The fact that it has this negative HP regen seems to imply that we have a base health regen on our character, which is actually atypical for Bethesda games. But I haven't been able to observe that actually taking place in any combat clips, so that could be an incorrect assumption. It is quite possible we could have no base HP regen without speccing into that through the skill trees, and then drinking one of these could end up actually knocking you down a full 60 HP, which honestly seems pretty punishing considering the healing numbers on some of the foods we're looking at next. While we're on the topic of HP regen, I was able to find this one clip, however, of our character killing an enemy that caused a level up and then instantly healed them to full HP. There's no guarantee it's tied to the level up, but it seems like a pretty likely candidate for a behavior like that to exist, and it's pretty common in many other games as well. This is one of the only clips I've been able to find of any HP actually regenning, but I feel like it's just a consumable that's active and it's showing when the healing will end once fully applied. We've got some low healing items that feel more like base ingredients to meaningful food items that will heal a significant amount or will have a greater value than the sum of the part. Midnight Delight, Toast, and Synth Meat Steak are the 3 that we see that heal almost nothing, but Synth Meat actually has some value to it. Then we have the Wondrous Patty Melt. It not only heals 15 HP, but this bad boy is also worth 295 credits, which is actually insane from an economy perspective. You could have 30 patty melts, or you could have a full-blown spaceship. Either the food eco in Starfield is whack, or they're living it up and space travel has never been more affordable. The Taamaya Pita is the same as the patty melt in value and healing, and then the coveted trilobites are a more gourmet-looking dish that boasts an insane 740 credits for what looks like barely an appetizer. They really went and threw some critters on a plate, slapped some butter on it, and said, give me $1,000. It's highway robbery, but you know what? I've got a space family to feed, so I'll be cooking these up all day and selling them to Nazim in the Cloud District to make ends meet. Beyond that, we see some alien jerky, implying we can harvest and utilize meats from creatures we kill in the wild, and then med packs which we can surely craft. One thing I'm not sure about is what the general availability of all these food items will be. For example, Synth Meat, Midnight Delight, and the orange juice are all clearly made by a corporation, so I'd expect us to have to purchase those, whereas the patty melt, pita, and trilobites could be a created dish as well as something we purchase. There are some specific components to things like the patty melt, like cheese and potatoes, so it'll be interesting to see how granular Bethesda makes us get in order to fully craft some of those more complex dishes. There are a couple other smaller details to point out regarding survivability that I also wanted to share here. First being that you'll notice in certain combat sequences that your health bar has this extra small yellow bar at the end. I'm inclined to say it's a temporary buff to max health and not a shield, as we see the health bar decrease while that yellow bar seems to stay intact. I'm guessing certain consumables will provide buffs like this, along with skills or traits that provide specific bonuses for performing particular actions. While this one's more offense than defense, it's worth noting that we don't seem to lose ammo when partially reloading weapons, which will be useful if bullets are in short supply so you don't have to worry about reloading between fights. It would be neat if we get some weapon mods where you'll instead drop your mag and lose whatever ammo was left in favor of a faster reload. Another important question is, how will difficulty really play into things now that we have leveled systems? It's been confirmed that there is no level cap, but how will our own level relate to the enemies we're fighting? My hope is that the more threatening enemies, like those crazy Deathclaw equivalent monsters we've seen, and some of the more aggressive large creatures, don't just become pushovers that we two-shot simply because they're level 10 in a starting system and we're level 250 50 hours into our playthrough. It would make sense if they retain some baseline power relative to our character no matter how far we progress. Whether that's just from a stats perspective that happens in the back end, or we see that visually by having enemy levels stay within a minimum threshold of our level as we extend our playthrough. Finally, there's the question of the game difficulty setting itself. This has always been a giant gripe of mine with games in general, where increased difficulty means the enemies just turn into giant damage sponges while still dealing more damage to you. I'm looking at you, Skyrim. Sure, it's technically more difficult, but it's simply not fun. I'm all for getting my shit kicked in on insane difficulties, but God, I hope they don't go overboard on HP scaling, because I think it's just a lazy way of creating difficulty. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for this one and hoping we instead get something like smarter, more aggressive enemies on a higher difficulty, which I do think is fun, but it's pretty rare to see something like that. If you enjoyed the video, consider hitting some buttons of your choosing to see more of the most well-researched Starfield content in our solar system and to help support the channel. If you want to understand the actual difference between weapon classes and types in all things combat, then check out entry 0.6 of the handbook next. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.